when we're talking about sales and marketing alignment, I think a lot of it is related to there's so much stuff you can do. There's so many marketing channels. There's so many different activities and processes to acquire customers. So you need to go in and prioritize.
Welcome to Your Intended Message, the perfect place for leaders and promising professionals who want to convey the intended message for greater success. Every week, we interview experts who address the challenges and best practices to deliver your message effectively. That might be one-to-one, one-to-few, or one-to-many. And perhaps the most important conversation, one-to-self. I'm your host, George Torok. My guest today is Gary Garth. Here's 3 facts that I think you should know about Gary. 1. In terms of authority, Gary is a serial entrepreneur, founder and CEO of Elevate.io. He's authored the 0 to 100 million sales blueprint book and the Goals, Grit, and Greatness Planner. It all sounds like necessary parts of greatness and success. 2, in terms of credibility, he's been featured in Inc., Forbes, Success, and many other prominent publications. As a serial entrepreneur since 2002, Gary has started and successfully exited 6 companies, including large outbound sales, call centers, radio advertising networks, and an award-winning 8-figure digital marketing agency. And 3, a little bit of fun here for Gary. In addition to being an entrepreneur, angel investor, and father, Gary's also a part-time DJ and regularly performs at clubs in Medellin, Colombia, where he lives. By the way, he's originally from Denmark, so he's moved a long way from the original home. Gary Garth, welcome to Your Intended Message.
George, thank you so much for having me. And thank you for that interesting introduction.
Delighted to be talking with you. You're sounding like a fascinating character. Gary, one of the topics that we talked about that you brought up that you encountered in building these businesses is that you notice that there's often a disconnect between sales and marketing. And so much so, sometimes they even hate each other and compete with each other.
That's a good way to put it.
What have you seen going on in this space, and why do you think it happens?
Well, there's a lot of reason for why it happens. I would say that initially I thought it was just with a certain, maybe it was more related to SMBs over like enterprise companies, and it was maybe just in select verticals. But in my last couple of projects, I was fortunate to work with like over 6,000 direct end advertisers, predominantly in the SMB space. Then after a while, we pivoted and also did a partner program. So channel sales, in other words, working with other marketing agencies. We had very close ties and still do with Google and Microsoft channel sales teams. And that's when I started to identify that regardless of the size of the company, regardless of the industry, very often sales and marketing is like these 2 siloed divisions that have different KPIs, different metrics they focus on, and a different overall value proposition focus. So obviously, the way to solve that, it starts at the top, right? It starts about securing that the leadership, the founder, the owner, to some extent, try to align these 2 departments with one core. Like an easy fix is to, for instance, align the KPIs, right? So it's not that very often you hear marketing folks, they like all the jargon and, okay, we got to generate MQLs, and they go into some sort of funnel, and sales is talking, is this a hot lead or not, right? So it's more about, okay, let's start with focusing on revenue and how can one department contribute towards the other one? How do we make sure that we're speaking the same language? And what kind of priorities can we roll out that actually makes a difference? So a few things that I always recommend companies is like, try to get your sales and marketing in the same room. Like instead of like sales is sitting on the 3rd floor and marketing on the 4th floor, try to put them on the same floor, and you'll see some magic happen just by them understanding the day-to-day of each other's life and promote some sporadic conversations around the water cooler, so to speak. Another thing is just having ongoing weekly meetings. So it's like a marketing meeting where you both have sales and marketing integrated and say, okay, how can we hit our Q2 targets? Like what can one department do for another? And very interestingly, what comes up is like, for instance, you will see, content strategy, SEO, and overall external communication is typically owned by marketing. But how often do they sit in and say, okay, Mr. Sales Guy, what are the typical obstacles that you hear from our prospects? Or what are like the top 3 reasons why they don't end up, why you potentially lose a deal? Which competitors do you come across the most? Like with that kind of intelligence, then you can go back and revise your whole communication and SEO content strategy and create articles that, for instance, sales can be using after a sales call, post-sales call, if they want to drop it into like a credibility factor. By the way, here's a recent article that our owner or chief revenue officer wrote about XYZ topic that we discussed on our call. Then all of a sudden, it also becomes sales enablement collateral, so to speak, that has actual value indirectly in the sales process. So there's a couple of things around that, but immediately when I see companies apply those best practices, then, magic happens.
And I heard several intriguing ideas there. And one of the simplest one was simply sales and marketing talking to each other and saying, what can we do for you? What can we do for each other?
Internal communication, yes. Very important to promote.
Now, some companies think the answer is, well, we'll just create a director or a VP of sales and marketing. See, it's all one now. Is that enough?
It's definitely a step in the right direction. Like I did that in my past as well. We had the VP of sales and a VP of fulfillment, a VP of marketing. Instead, try to create a role, chief revenue officer, that basically has everybody report into them. And by that, securing that, there's alignment, but it's not enough because typically it's you got to go to a level. And that's why I say I would even, for instance, create a weekly sales marketing meeting where I would include account executives from sales and the marketing coordinators from the marketing team, because they're the actual ones doing a lot of the content creation, speaking with the prospects. So having them align and understanding, why am I writing this piece of content? That this understanding that that's the account executives I'm sitting with in this meeting that will be using it. And maybe they can explain it in simple terms or words that is not necessarily translated through like a objective of, hey, we got to write content about XYZ topic. I would say you got to integrate across all layers in the departments and that's why I say like going to the degree of even putting sales and marketing on the sales floor. It seems like, I know, very unconventional, and marketing is like, this is going to be noisy and we're going to have all these guys speaking loud on the phone and so forth, but it can be really effective. This way, all of a sudden there's a collaboration. In my last company, even I saw like, then you got sales going over and giving marketing a high five because a qualified lead came in. And then all of a sudden, it becomes one army in the same front. It's really powerful.
And I've seen the case where marketing gets leads and then sales can't close the leads and they end up pointing fingers at each other instead of saying, well, maybe we're getting the wrong leads or maybe we're giving the leads the wrong message.
Yes. Correct. And actually, I put that in my book as well. In chapter 6, it's called "In God We Trust, Everybody Else Brings Data." I think that's a good place to start because, you get what you measure. And I outlined 20 metrics from a sales and marketing standpoint that you should have locked down. So it's not just about KPIs achieving 60% year-over-year growth or hitting X amount of sales next quarter. It's like diving into the details of the actual sales funnel and process, measuring all those elements. Because all of a sudden, once you have that in place, the conversations between sales and marketing become more about collaboration instead of pointing fingers. Because otherwise, you have the scenario where it's like marketing is saying, yeah, we sent you over all these leads, but sales suck. They're not answering. They're not following up on leads. They're not pitching it properly, and they can't close anything, right? And sales is saying, like, you're just sending us all these weak, unqualified leads that are not our ideal customer profile. So getting them in the same room and aligning on the metrics is very powerful. But it all starts with, understanding the customers better. And that's where maybe the topic of strategic marketing comes into play. Like I put in my book, failing to prepare is preparing to fail, essentially, right? It all starts with, we touched upon this briefly prior to our talk today, it's about understanding your ideal customer profile from not only a firmographic standpoint, but even to the level of psychographics, what moves them, right? Now, all of a sudden, you can start creating content and communication that actually touches upon the true pain points and the true motivation. We're all driven by avoiding pain or attaining pleasure, right? So the more you can tap into that from a marketing standpoint, the more can sales leverage that kind of communication, so to speak.
And what I'm hearing there is that both sales and marketing need to have the same definition of who the customer is.
Mm-hmm. Correct. Yes.
And when they're on different floors or different rooms, they go off into their own little worlds and come up with what they think, which could be quite different. Because if they're not talking to say, hey, no, we think this is the customer. No, wait a minute. Here's what we're finding when we knock on their doors. They don't think like that at all.
Yeah. So, I mean, a classic scenario is, marketing goes ahead and studies the firmographics, XYZ company that operates in this space with X amount of employees, X amount of revenue, potentially has adopted these technologies. They are a good fit for our solution. And here's the typical decision makers in that process. Whereas sales, when they undergo the whole journey as to acquiring the customer, they understand, okay, the first obstacle is creating awareness about the solution you're offering. So if it's a product that's related to the CTO or the CMO, depending on what you're selling, first you want to educate them to some extent of like why this can be contributing value. At the same time, the chief executive officer or the CFO, for that matter, typically wants to see everything from an ROI standpoint. Their question is always going to be, this sounds great. I love all these extra smart features and I love that it's going to make your day easier, but how is this going to impact the bottom line? So it's kind of two different value propositions and you got to have different pieces of the content to understand, okay, the sales rep first has to pitch the value to, for instance, the CTO or how this can save time, how this will drive more efficiency, how this will reduce the risk of XYZ. And then when it lands on the CFO or the CEO, depending on the decision-making process, they need to quantify that into what does that mean from our ROI standpoint. So that's different kinds of content, if that makes sense. And that's where the alignment between sales and marketing, understanding not only the customers in more detail, but the sales process and which kind of content fits into the equation. Like in the book, I put, like when we're talking about sales and marketing alignment, I think a lot of it is related to there's so much stuff you can do. There's so many marketing channels. There's so many different activities and processes to acquire customers. So you need to go in and prioritize. In my book, I put like 20 examples of sales enablement collateral that you should try to promote. And the first thing could be to sit down, have this list, and then start aligning like, okay, what do we find most effective? Is it webinars over in-person participation of industry-related events? When we're talking about a content strategy, is it more from a SEO standpoint we want your ranking, or is it more for creating authority, credibility, or is it more so thought leader articles that can spark interest and help them throughout the sales process? So you can only create so much content and roll out so many marketing activities. So aligning on, like, for instance, like what do we want to focus on? What can make the biggest impact for our short-term targets? That's a good place to start.
In the companies that you built, how did you address the misalignment between marketing and sales?
Well, I would say my book is the outcome of the learnings. It could also be labeled 101 things to avoid, right? So I've done all the mistakes you can do. And that's where my recommendations come. So practically speaking, one of the big ones was putting sales and marketing on the same floor. Another one is integrating from a system standpoint, So nowadays, sales tech and MarTech is two very hot topics, right? In average, companies have over 60 technologies that they adopt, right? Across everything, HR, finance, sales, and marketing. Most companies have over 10 sales technologies, and the same goes for marketing technologies. So for instance, if marketing is using some tool for marketing automation, and sales is using something as a CRM, and then also like a sales and engagement tool, something to send out emails and engage prospects in a sequence, aligning those tools is key. That I learned the hard way, because otherwise everybody's operating in different interfaces, different systems, and aligning them in one can make a tremendous impact. The third thing is, as I mentioned, establishing equal KPIs. So maybe be that overall, the overarching KPI is hitting XYZ revenue target and so forth. And then it drilled down into individual departmental KPIs that are still aligned, and then putting people in meetings together, having weekly reports around it. So you, again, surface the communication ongoing. It's not like a quarterly thing that we get together and meet and talk about objectives. It's let's meet on a weekly basis and talk about the micro conversion, so to speak, all the small little wins and activities that needs to take place in order to hit that quarterly target. So it's not too late, in other words.
And it's fairly simple. I would think it's fairly simple to measure revenue. You just look, you just see what came in. So that's easy to measure. However, getting the revenue is a process. Mm-hmm. And we need to make the process as efficient and effective as possible. So we still need to measure the steps in the process itself.
Yes.
But however, the danger is when people get too focused on the process and they forget the result.
So I would say, no, you're right on the money here, George, because it's typically in the process that you get the outcome. I mean, by obsessing, I would say, even about the process and the activities and these small little metrics, you will get the outcome. So I think that's where you should spend the time. I'm trying to think of a practical example that I can elaborate on. So, for instance, okay, you're running a direct response marketing campaign. You're trying to generate leads through a Google Ads campaign, for example. You're running some email marketing campaign, or you're purchasing ads, some sort of advertising in some channel. Very often, for most advertisers, it's either form submissions, they go to your websites, submit the contact info, or they're making a phone call. In most of the industries I work in, it's like 70, 80% of all leads come through phone calls. So classic scenario, marketing is looking, okay, XYZ keyword or campaign or geography is generating phone calls at, say, a hypothetical $50 cost. This is great. Now we are hitting the targeted cost per lead. That's the metrics of success for marketing, right? Sales, on the other hand, they're getting all these leads, but they're not necessarily qualified prospects. Then maybe they don't have a high commercial intent. They're not ready. They're just at a awareness phase getting treated. Whereas, if there was a feedback loop, so you install something like keyword level call tracking to the equation, and you have a feedback loop where every sales rep qualifies the call, or you have in my companies, I had like an individual that would listen to all phone calls that would generate leads because we had such a high volume. They were neither in sales or marketing. They would just be almost like a QA, quality assurance, assessing each lead, scoring them according to parameters we had set up, and then following them from a pipeline standpoint. And then if you start doing that at a consistent basis and start assigning whether they got close one, whether it was unqualified lead or where they are in the pipeline, now the feedback loop between sales and marketing becomes just significantly more elevated. And maybe that lead for $50 that looks like marketing is killing it, maybe it's, we only close 1 out of 10, whereas the $200 cost per lead, where we're closing 80% of those leads, is actually more valuable. There's a higher ROI. So having that feedback loop significantly helps on hitting the overarching company objectives, but also fostering that collaboration between the two departments. So it's not just, I'm just measured on how many leads I generate, you, George, and the cost per lead, but more about, okay, what return on ad spend can we collectively attain, and then make that, for instance, the main metrics. That's something that both departments can understand and work towards.
Now, sales and marketing each comes with their own bias, and you admit that you are an unashamed sales guy. Did you struggle with these marketing people? Did you have a hard time understanding them or getting them to work with you?
No, not necessarily. I did work on marketing campaigns for a period, like a couple of years in my last company. I used to actually manage a lot of the campaigns for some of our key accounts and clients. That was like one of my values, is always be learning. So in order to become a better sales rep or a sales leader, you need to have a deep product understanding, right? Otherwise, you're just an expensive proxy that's always relying on getting some expert on the call or facilitating different people's interests and questions. So for me, that's non-negotiable element of a top sales performer. But I think it really drills down to talking about the money. It can be made that simple, because essentially that's what every business owner, every founder of a company or CEO is going to be focused on. So if you're able to begin with end in mind and say, okay, what's the value of a customer from a lifetime value standpoint? So you understand the ratio between the cost per acquisition and the lifetime value, and then can start questioning every single element throughout that process. Then the conversations become easier, because, whether it's metrics like a click-through rate or a level of engagement or how many likes a postcard or whatever it may be, if you always try to quantify that and say, okay, maybe we can't measure the direct ROI, but explain to me in simple terms how this will contribute towards the end goal of acquiring X amount of customers with this lifetime value, then the conversations all of a sudden become easier and everybody gets on the same page. So I haven't had a hard time on it. My recommendation would be always, instead of just, being very subject matter specific and saying, okay, I'm doing PPC campaigns on Google Ads, and that's all I do. So we're talking about just this channel and this, then understanding, okay, how does this fit into the equation, right? Sometimes to give an example, sometimes certain keywords might not necessarily drive profitability, but you are controlling a message in your industry, in your geo, and you're securing that that you own that message and your brand, in other words, in certain scenarios. So if you understand how it fits into the equation and can explain it in layman's terms, then you're a long way. So just asking those questions can help any sales guy break down the marketing lingo, I would say.
So it sounds like what I heard there is that both marketing and sales need to be, one, more open and more willing to ask questions of each other and themselves. That's correct.
It's a good summary. Thank you, George.
Gary, for those who'd like to learn more about you and your book, the website is garygarth.com, and you can find that link in the description below. You can also find the book on Amazon, and you can find the link below. Gary, as we prepare to wrap up, if you could sit down with a company leader who has a sales department over here and a marketing department over here, maybe not even in the same building, what 1, 2, or 3 pieces of advice would you give that sales leader to get these people to work together?
Great question. I guess that's $1 million question here. You know what? I see in 9 out of 10 scenarios when I work with companies, the very first thing you can do to get an immediate assessment of how much collaboration there is between these two departments, how well they understand each other, and what areas of opportunity you can address, is get them in a room together and then have them both map out the entire customer journey. So before they even become a customer, their prospect, and that whole process to when they become a customer, and understanding also, if you're looking at it from as a business owner standpoint, the ability to cross-sell, upsell products, collect testimonials, create case studies. How many referrals do you have? Understanding that whole process and aligning on all the different metrics, you'll probably get one very clear picture from sales and another picture from marketing. So aligning those two customer journeys and having one universal one will all of a sudden spark a lot of opportunities, because sometimes, the customer is continuously has communication with the account manager or account executive in B2B, for example, but do they know exactly when to identify an upsell or cross-sell opportunity and how to promote it? Could marketing, for example, provide some content or collateral, case studies, an ROI calculator that can demonstrate if you did XYZ and expanded your service from package A to B, or added this other product to the equation, here's the expected impact, financially speaking, as a result of that. All of a sudden, you'll see a lot of revenue opportunities. So just mapping out the entire customer journey. That would be step number 1.
Sounds like a powerful place to start, and probably strange to a lot of marketing and sales people, but a good place to start. My guest today is Gary Garth, reminding you to get your sales and marketing aligned by putting them on the same floor, in the same room, talking the same language. If you like what you heard,
Tell your friends and post your 5-star review on Apple Podcasts because that helps more listeners find us. Come back every week for more practical insights to help you deliver your intended message. I'm your host, George Torok.